as I said in the opening remarks, what we're talking about today is how technology, and really this intersection of art, science, and technology, and thinking about how ideas come together to determine how we can make a difference and how we can make an impact, and how specifically we can make an impact on government officials and stakeholders to ensure that no one gets left behind. So I'm just checking to make sure my speakers are here, and it looks like they are. So our next session is about setting the stage for the second machine age. We're going to explore the challenges and opportunities that the new machine age brings, and especially in regions where they're struggling to deal with emerging technologies and how they're massively impacting people's economies. So we are very fortunate to have Andrew McAfee and Asma Khalid, who are going to talk about how emerging technologies are fundamentally changing our economy. Andrew McAfee is co-founder and one of my colleagues at MIT. He's the co-founder of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and he studies how computer technologies are changing business, the economy, and society. And Asma is a reporter for WBUR, and she leads Bostonomics, a new WBUR team covering the economy, startups, and companies driving the innovation. So, if I could have Andy and Asma come on up on stage. You guys mic'd?
We are mic'd.
Awesome, Andy.
The only thing I lack is an interviewer. Hi. Did you all have to suffer through David Kong? I apologize for that. Was that really painful for everybody? We run a tight ship here.
Great. So thank you so much. We're going to have kind of a brief conversation, and I'd love for people to chime in and ask questions. So what I was going to suggest is if you tweet me questions, I can take a look. I'll be paying attention to what you're saying at the same time. And then afterwards, it's a fairly small room, so we can have people chime in with questions on the mic as well. But if you feel a burning desire during the conversation, you can feel free to tweet me. My handle is @AsmaMK. So that's A as in Alpha, S as in Sam, M as in Mary, A as in Alpha, M as in Mary, K, and I will be checking that periodically. So we're going to try to dive in real quick and talk about a whole bunch of different questions. I'd love for you to first just explain to us what you mean by the second machine age. I know you've written about that and spoken about that quite a bit.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all for coming out today. Asma and I just learned backstage that we grew up about 2 towns away from each other in kind of the middle of nowhere, Indiana. So this is a very strange confluence. It's an example of the kind of connections that Hub Week is all about, I think. So it's great to see you again. Eric Brynjolfsson and I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Second Machine Age, and we were trying to make 2 points with the book. There's kind of a good news, more challenging news story that we were trying to tell. And the good news is that we are in one of these periods of weird, astonishing, crazy technological progress, the kind of progress that we see not, once a decade, once a generation, but probably about once a century. The last time things were this interesting was when we got electricity and the internal combustion engine. What we're getting now is artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles, and the fact that we are interconnecting humanity with each other and with humanity's accumulated knowledge for the first time ever. That's never, ever happened before. So the first thing we wanted to do was draw attention to this amazing period that we're all living in. And that's really profoundly good news. The old joke among economists is that tech progress is the only free lunch that we believe in. So the lunch is getting pretty fantastic these days. The challenging news, and the other point we were trying to make with the book, is that there is no law that says that that the abundance, that the prosperity that we get from technology is going to be shared in a way that strikes people as fair, that strikes people as equitable. There's no guarantee that it will be shared in the same way that it was shared in the past. And some people can feel like they're getting a lousy deal instead of a fantastic deal from tech progress. And in particular, some workers have skills that become less valuable as technology can do more and more. And dealing with that fact, we wrote in 2014, is a pretty serious challenge. And given some of the things that have been happening over the course of 2016, I think we were correct about that.
So, Andy, what you described is that there are obviously benefits to this era that we're all living in, but challenges. So if you had to summarize, are we living in the best of times or the worst of times or maybe somewhere in between?
Yeah, I think we're living in thrilling times. Honestly, that's the word that I would use. And for a lot of us, these times are thrilling in a really, really good way, but not all thrills are positive ones. And so we're living in maybe shocking times is even a better word. A lot of people are experiencing some negative shocks. The future is coming at us very quickly. That is uncomfortable for a lot of people. And it's not all just perception. It is the case that some people who want to play by the rules and want to go get an education, get trained, and go offer themselves to an employer in exchange for a good middle-class living, like that's getting tougher to do for a lot of people. And pretending that's not the case is a really bad idea.
So Andy, let's talk a little bit about work, right? And how technology is affecting many of the jobs that we all do. Do you have a sense of what future jobs will look like? And I know that's a really broad question, so maybe you can divide that up. Yeah, different. So can
Not like today.
I mean, are there things that people can do to prepare themselves or skill sets that we can acquire to be better prepared for those changes?
Yeah, let me try to give a simplified history that's not too badly oversimplified. The large, stable, prosperous American middle class, which is really one of the great achievements of our society over the course of the country's history. The large, stable, prosperous American middle class was built on the back of routine work. And I mean both routine physical work, think about an assembly line worker in a factory, and routine mental work. Think about the payroll clerk in that same factory, the accountant in that same factory. Those jobs are gone. They are not coming back. And they've gone to Shenzhen and Bangalore, but even more, they've gone to automation, software, increasingly robots in those days. It's a dangerous business to make really confident predictions about the future when things are changing this quickly. But one prediction I'm very confident at is that the United States is never again going to have a large, stable, prosperous middle class doing industrial era routine work. It's just going to be, it's cheaper and higher quality to have that work done by technology.
And my follow-up to that, though, Andy, is, is it possible for the United States to have a strong middle class that I would argue politically is very important for us to have, but are we all doing different types of work?
Yeah, so you're asking exactly the really important question for the next generation. I'm not willing to give up on the idea of a large, stable, prosperous middle class. I think we can have one, at least until the robots get unbelievably capable. But we have to be preparing and training people very differently than we're doing today, because we're still training and educating people for that industrial era middle class. We're training people to do routine work that the machines are already better at. So one of the important things we need to change is just to rethink and reform education. Training the kinds of workers we needed 70 years ago is a really, really bad idea.
People often talk to me in these conversations a little bit about creativity being this kind of important or essential skill for some of these jobs. Do you agree? And I guess I'm curious, can we all kind of hone that in the same way? It's very easy for many of us to learn a routine task. Is that something that can be learned or trained?
I think it can, and we can certainly increase people's ability to do innovative, creative work, but those aren't the only jobs of the future. It's one of the big mistakes that I come across is to have people say, well, we all have to learn coding because the only jobs are going to be high-end STEM jobs in computer science or super high-end creative jobs. There's a lot of demand for that, but there's even more demand for good social skills. And by that, the evidence is really clear that abilities like negotiation, persuasion, motivation, coordination, these are really, really valuable skills. If you're good at these, you have lots of different avenues to at least a good middle-class life. So that's why I have confidence about the ability to sustain a middle class. The challenge is I don't think our educational system does a great job of teaching those skills. We do a lot of work by yourself and solve little math problems. The machines are better at that.
So Andy, you've described an education system that really, it sounds like in your mind, isn't really up to snuff in terms of training these next type of skilled workers. I mentioned to you before we got on stage that I covered the presidential campaign the last 2 years, and I think one of the most obvious takeaways was that there was massive disruption, job disruption that we've all seen in large parts of the country. I asked you a really sort of candid question backstage, but you said, let's talk about it here, and that is, how do you understand what happened in this election, given the work you do around the economy and the changing skill set that people need, and is it likely to get worse?
Yeah, so everybody's got their own explanation for the election of 2016, right? So here's mine. There are a lot of people who felt like they were playing by the rules. And by playing by the rules, they were going to get a ticket to that American dream, to a good middle-class life, a better life over time, and an even better life for their kids. And so they went and got an education, they tried to get skills, and there's this perception, I'm sure you came across it on the campaign trail, there's this very widespread perception that they tried to play by the rules, and then things got flipped on them, and they got a raw deal instead of a good deal in exchange. And we have seen, without naming names, we have seen extraordinarily good demagogues, brilliant communicators come along and kind of amplify that resentment, feed off it, and turn it into election victories. The second question you asked is, are things going to get worse? Gang, demagogues have really, really bad policy ideas. So restoring the American middle class via coal mining jobs is not a thing that is going to happen under any realistic scenario. So if we don't get our policies right, if we don't get our approaches right, then absolutely things can get worse. If we keep doubling down on the jobs that were around in 1962, yeah, things can get a lot worse, which is why we have to keep getting out there and keep advocating for facing into the future as opposed to just kind of yearning for the past.
Do you feel at this point, though, that there are certain steps that can be taken outside of like a political or public policy realm to bring about those changes? Because it almost sounds like what you're describing is like massive social upheaval unless something is done, right? I mean, you can't have a sort of squashed middle class and people who feel like they got the raw end of the deal for years and years and years to come without any sort of economic solutions.
Yeah, I agree with that. In addition to advocating for smart policies and for expressing our right, for participating in democracy as citizens by voting, I just think in general, we have a choice. Bob Putnam is a sociologist at Harvard, and I've learned a ton from him. He documents this crazy tension in American life throughout the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. And it's a tension between two pretty fundamental ideas about what it means to be an American and what this country's all about. And one is this notion of kind of we're all in this together. We're a team, we're Americans, we're facing this together. The other one is more this rugged individualistic notion of America. I'm looking out for me, I'm looking out pretty close to home. And what's crazy is you can find evidence for which of these two schools of thought about America has been more or less popular over time. And when Bob does this work, he draws these crazy graphs about how, for the entire post-war period, until about 1980, We were becoming a more we're all in this together society. And you can just look at marriage across class lines and membership in the Elks Club and the Rotary and stuff like that. And just this kind of community glue in America was increasing up until around 1980. And ever since then, for the past 35 plus years, that has been going in the other direction. And this notion of I'm looking out for myself and you're on your own has been increasingly dominant in American life. I think that is the wrong trajectory, especially for times as kind of weird and uncertain as this. I think it's turning our back on some of the real the glories of the society that we've created and the things that have worked well for us. So I love your question. One thing that we can all do is try to make that curve start to head back in the other direction, back in the we're all in this together, we're a community, we're one people kind of direction. That you don't need to vote to do that. You can do that in your life.
I just have one quick question, then we can sort of open it up to questions from you all. And that is, you've looked at the effect of technology, and we've been talking a lot about work and what this means for our jobs. But we've also seen very recently the effect that major tech companies have had, and some would say negatively influencing our lives. You may think of sort of the influence of Google or Facebook on some of that social cohesion, but also on electoral politics. Are there ways that people can change that conversation or publicly apply pressure to sort of affect some of the consequences we've begun to see from major tech companies in our lives?
Yeah, this is such a great question, because one question that I try to ask myself all the time is, what have you changed your mind about recently? And if the answer is nothing, you're not thinking hard enough, is the way I look at it. So I've actually changed my mind about the question that you ask, the influence that these gigantic tech companies are having in our lives. I used to be kind of dismissive of this argument that they were having a negative influence in our lives. I thought they're having an overwhelmingly positive influence in our lives. And then we started to learn how governments who are not our best friends in the world were able to use these platforms to destabilize our society and destabilize our electoral process. Like, that evidence is overwhelming these days. That's an actual problem. That is a deadly serious problem. It's a very hard one to fix, because the great platform, the huge platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter, the reason they become so powerful and so big is by letting all of us generate huge amounts of content and letting people buy ads in a very self-service way. And what that enables is these companies have scaled up and become huge very, very quickly. What that makes difficult is intervening in either the process of sharing content or targeting ads to different people. I hope the tech companies wake up and realize that they have to change a couple of those things so that we can't have a repeat of foreign countries meddling in our elections very effectively, brilliantly, by using social platforms. Now, that's easy to say. It's actually kind of hard to do. The Facebook model does not have a Facebook employee reviewing every ad that shows up on their platform. Their business model does not work that way. So what do they do? That's a tough question, but as always, step number one in change is realizing the need to change. I think these companies were reluctant to admit that they needed to change. They're finally coming around to that. What we can all do is just kind of keep up the pressure and make our displeasure with this known, and provide lots of incentive for the tech companies to actually address this stuff effectively, because I do not want my country's elections getting meddled with by foreign governments using technology platforms, and we can't ignore that anymore. Thank you.
At that point, let's open it up to questions. I did get one on Twitter, so maybe we'll hit that before we get questions via the microphone. And this is from Rodrigo. I don't know if you're in the audience still, but as bio and digital are converging, how do you think of bio machines that evolve?
A question for David Kong. Is David still here? Because he's the synthetic bio guy. What we're seeing is that these two domains of science and technology and innovation are converging, because we write code with software with zeros and ones. The code of your life and my life is written with 4 letters in a great big weird molecule called DNA. That is not a very big difference at all. It's an incredibly complicated code, and my understanding is the more we go, the more we understand just how complicated it is. So I don't think that we're going to be able to monkey with life, 3 weeks from now. It's just much more complicated than that. But the pace of innovation is amazing here, and bio-innovation and digital innovation are almost becoming one and the same thing. I get more excited about that than nervous, but again, we need to be mindful that if this is a really powerful toolkit we're opening up, and some crazy things and some bad things can happen, I usually am very reluctant to say we need more government oversight of X, Y, or Z. I think that's a great way to slow down innovation. Maybe we want to slow some of this down and be kind of mindful about it. That might call for some oversight in the realm of bio, maybe. But we need to do it in a very, very thoughtful way.
Andy, there's another question here from somebody whose name says Spooky Molly. Not sure exactly what that is. And she asks, what is the role of Silicon Valley and tech leaders in ensuring the longevity of the middle class? In other words, should there be a role? Do they have a responsibility?
I love this question because, again, my easy answer to it, and one that I still believe, is that the role of business in our society is to turn out more goods and services to increase the prosperity of our lives. And by that, I don't just mean cheap plastic junk and likes up and down. That's a caricature. What these companies are actually turning out is the ability for all of us to communicate with each other, to educate ourselves, to keep in touch with loved ones, to access huge amounts of knowledge that have been created in the world. These are powerful innovations. These are big, big deals. So I am kind of adamant that the role that Silicon Valley has been bringing good things to our lives at an unprecedented rate. However, like you and I have been talking about, it is also true that the middle class in America is under threat, and tech progress is part of the reason why. When I go talk to leaders in Silicon Valley, uniformly, they are aware of this challenge and trying to figure out what to do about it. What I think they should not do about it is deliberately slow down their pace of innovation or their pace of rolling new things out. That'd be like saying we need to slow down the rate at which we educate people. I think it's just an absolutely terrible idea.
It's so interesting that you say that, Andy, because one of the most salient interviews I did after the campaign, I went to Youngstown, Ohio, which, for those of you who don't know, it's sort of an old steel mill central area, and I met with a union leader who had a lot of concerns about driverless cars, particularly the effect this could have on the trucking industry. And he said, look at my area. If there are driverless trucks, it will decimate our area. And I said, so, okay, what do you think that we should do? He's also a local Democratic Party leader. And he said, I wish that the Democratic Party would just essentially put the brakes on this, like not allow that type of innovation to happen.
Here's why that's a deeply bad idea. I understand the impetus behind it. We got to preserve jobs for the middle class people, and middle class jobs are under threat right now. If we do that, so let's say that we have this autonomous car and we deliberately don't roll it out. What we're saying to blind people is you don't have more mobility in your lives. What we're saying to disabled people is we're not going to give you this tool to provide more mobility to your life. We kill about 30,000 people a year in highway accidents in the United States. The only way we'll ever allow autonomous cars is if they're much, much safer. So we're saying to the families of the 30,000 people who would die if we didn't have autonomous cars that jobs are more important than those 30,000 lives every year. I reject that argument. I want our vulnerable populations, like the elderly, the blind, the disabled, to have more options in their lives, to have more mobility, for example. I want to kill fewer people on our roads. Now, my personal moral balance, would I take the job loss? I want to be clear. Yes, I would. Being mindful of the fact that there is this consequence, that jobs will be lost. As far as we can tell, there are about 3 million people in America who make their living driving stuff. And 3 million jobs sounds like a lot. There are somewhere about 1.5 million layoffs every month in the United States. We have a very, very dynamic economy. So can we absorb over a period of a few years 3 million additional layoffs without breaking a sweat? We can absolutely do that. The problem is that these are 3 million of the people who are least likely to easily move on to a different career. They're the most likely. I'm talking about kind of middle-aged, somewhat less educated men. These are the people who, when their old livelihood goes away, they very often just go sit on the sidelines of the economy. And that's really bad news, because sitting on the sidelines of the economy doesn't, by definition, doesn't contribute, and it leads to all kinds of bad health outcomes that we're becoming aware of. When you look around communities where there are plenty of jobs, you don't see the opioid crisis as clearly. So it's not a matter of the volume of jobs with autonomous cars, it's about the type of people that have those jobs. I wish I had the magic answer for that. One thing we could do, we absolutely should do, is this is a wonderful time to be investing in upgrading our nation's infrastructure. The American infrastructure gets a grade of, it's either a C- or a D+ from the Civil Engineering Society. I can easily imagine a decade project. Would all of us like to see potholes fixed in the city of Boston? Wouldn't that be amazing? Our infrastructure is kind of a national joke. We could put exactly those people who are displaced by autonomous cars, we could put them to work for a long time to come, getting our infrastructure up to an A grade, because I can tell you, the robots, they're amazing these days. They are not anywhere near able to fill a pothole, repair a bridge, add on a new terminal to an airport. This is human work for exactly the kinds of people who are being displaced by technology.
The immune system is...
We have a few minutes left for questions, and I do think do we have mics or? Yep, okay, go ahead in front. And I do encourage you all, please, questions, not statements.
And if you could peek slowly, because we have an echo up here.
Yeah, the sound is tough. Kind of following up on what you were just speaking to, thinking about could you speak to the value work in the future and the idea of maybe a guaranteed basic income, decoupling work from having to make a living?
Repeat that, maybe just Andy, before you answer.
Yeah, so the question is one that's on the minds of a lot of people these days. How do we think about the value of work in the future? And what about this specific idea that's out there called a universal basic income? It's an idea that I hear a lot when I go to Silicon Valley, for example, and it's an incredibly simple idea. If the problem is that people do not have enough money, give them money. Just give them a no strings attached, no questions asked, not huge, but a small income every month so that they can go afford to live their lives. I don't like the UBI for two reasons. Number one is it's expensive. America's a big country, and actually handing out a check to everybody every month, even if that check is not very big, wow, is that an expensive proposition. The bigger deal, the reason I really don't like it, though, is related to the first part of your question about the value of work. Because of the research that Eric and I and our colleagues have done, I'm a fanatic about work. I think work is incredibly important for a person, for a family, and for a community. We put in our book this wonderful quote from Voltaire, who said in the 1700s, Voltaire said that work saves us from three great evils: boredom, vice, and need. Of those three, the need is the easy one to take care of. We're a wealthy society. The other evils caused by a lack of work, man, those are where I really see the problem. The thought experiment that I always run in my head is to think about the communities that are just being ravaged by the opioid epidemic, ravaged by this kind of sense of hopelessness. And the evidence is scary about how bad that is. And the question I ask myself is, which problems in those communities would be solved by a check from the government showing up every month? And my answer is absolutely none. Like, it would not make things any better. Now, another aspect of that is what would be solved if productive, meaningful work came back to those communities in large volumes? Wow, Like the result of that thought experiment for me is things would get a lot better in those communities. So because of all that, I'm a fanatic about work and about before we say, well, there are no more jobs, so let's have a universal basic income. No, let's actually try to create jobs in those places.
Questions? Yep, right there.
So 2 quick questions. One is, what policy levers would you recommend for the government to most efficiently and effectively empower this decaying middle class with meaningful employment? And the second is, you spoke earlier about Putnam's dialogue around decaying social capital in the US, which I think is really important. What role do you think technology plays? And you spoke about the advantages that technology brings to our lives. What role do you think technology plays in fraying social capital and increasing senses of isolation, diminishing attention spans and things of that nature?
And I see we're just about out of time. Thank you all for coming. These are 2 fantastic questions, and I think this is the last one that we have time for. So these are 2 great notes to end on. The first question was, what's the right policy playbook for this world that we're heading into? The second one is, what role does technology play in this decrease in social capital that we see very clearly in this country these days? So the policy question, I think, is actually the easier one. And whenever I think about smart policies, I just start humming the old McDonald's song to myself. And then he had E-I-E-I-O. And for me, that helps me remember what I think the smart policies are: education, immigration reform, entrepreneurship, infrastructure, and the O is original research. Government should be funding basic research. All right, how are we doing on education reform? Lousy. How are we doing on immigration reform, letting the world's most talented and ambitious people come here to build their lives and careers? Really lousy. How are we doing on entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship, despite Silicon Valley, is on a long, slow, steady decline in America. That's terrifying. Infrastructure, we've already talked about, a D+ grade on that. And funding for basic research is maybe holding steady, maybe going down. So on all these 5 important areas, and this is Econ 101. We've talked to tons of economists. Nobody disagrees with this. We're doing a lousy to incredibly lousy job on the basic policies that would help us out right now. So we advocate for changing that. Your question about social capital was declining in America before we had social media. Unfortunately, I think the evidence is convincing me that social media might, on balance, be contributing to more isolation than more cohesion. What I think that implies, though, is not shut off social media, not demonize social media. For me, what it implies is put down the damn phone once in a while and go talk to a human being. My generation, we talk about how dangerous these technologies are. My generation survived the most evil technology designed to precisely rot our brains and turn us into zombies that we've ever developed. I'm talking about network TV, of course. Like, we got through that. We can easily handle the disruptions that come from social media. We need to be mindful about them. We need to put down the dang phone and go talk to other people once in a while. And I think that's a pretty good note to end on, right?
Hey, thank you so much.
And thank you all for coming out. Asma, thank you.